Master engineer David Chen's workshop occupied a corner of New Geneva Station's maintenance sector that most people found either too noisy or too cluttered to visit regularly, which suited David perfectly. The constant hum of diagnostic equipment, the organized chaos of spare parts arranged according to principles only he fully understood, and the complex smell of various lubricants and cleaning solvents created an environment where he could focus on the precise work of keeping exosuits and combat armor functioning at optimal capacity. Another day, another damaged suit that someone claims fell down some stairs, David muttered to himself as he reviewed the morning's work orders. 3 diplomatic security suits needing minor recalibration. 1 explorer's environmental armor with suspicious blast scoring that definitely hadn't come from falling downstairs, and a request for consultation on integrating human shielding technology with alien defensive systems. The consultation request was unusual enough to catch his attention. Most clients wanted repairs that would return their equipment to original specifications, rather than improvements that might void warranties or raise questions about authorized modifications. But the credit authorization was substantial, and David had learned that curiosity about his clients' motivations was less profitable than expertise in making their equipment work better than the manufacturers had originally intended. He was configuring his testing array when she arrived. The young woman who entered his workshop moved with the kind of controlled grace that suggested extensive combat training, though her civilian clothes and polite demeanor marked her as someone who preferred avoiding conflicts rather than seeking them. Her ears rose to elegant points that identified her as Velnathi, while the sophisticated translation device at her throat meant she could communicate in flawless, standard Galactic despite her species' naturally complex language. "Master Chen," she said, her voice carrying the formal courtesy that Velnathi used when dealing with professional services. "I am Lyra. I believe you received a consultation request regarding armor integration." "I did." David studied her, noting the alert intelligence in her violet eyes and the way she unconsciously favored her left side, suggesting recent injury or equipment malfunction. Though I should mention that consultation usually involves examining the actual equipment in question. "Of course." Lyra activated a personal transport beacon, and moments later a hovercart arrived carrying what appeared to be the most sophisticated combat exosuit David had ever seen outside of military research facilities. The armor was clearly Velnathi in design, but incorporated technologies that David recognized as experimental human shielding systems, integrated power sources that suggested access to classified research, and damage patterns that told the story of someone who'd been in serious combat very recently. "Interesting combination of systems," David said, beginning his preliminary examination while trying not to show too much curiosity about how a civilian contractor had acquired equipment that should have been restricted to military personnel. Human deflector arrays integrated with Velnathi adaptive plating, quantum power distribution networks, and what appears to be experimental neural interface technology. "You can work with these systems." "I can work with anything that follows basic principles of physics, though I should warn you that modifications to equipment this sophisticated might require replacement parts that are difficult to source through normal channels." David activated his diagnostic systems, immediately noting power fluctuations and integration failures that suggested the armor had been pushed far beyond its design specifications. "What exactly happened to cause this kind of damage?" "Equipment malfunction during a training exercise," Lyra replied with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested the truth was considerably more complex than training accidents. "Training exercise," David repeated, examining blast scoring that looked more like weapons fire than malfunction damage. "Must have been quite a comprehensive exercise." "Very comprehensive. Can the systems be repaired?" David spent the next hour conducting detailed diagnostics, finding himself increasingly impressed by the armor's design philosophy and increasingly curious about its wearer's identity. The suit incorporated defensive technologies that he'd only seen in theoretical research papers, while the damage patterns suggested someone who understood both the capabilities and limitations of their equipment well enough to push it to its limits without destroying it completely. "The good news is that the core systems are intact," David announced after completing his analysis. "The bad news is that the integration between human and Velnathi technologies has created some interesting compatibility issues that will require custom solutions rather than standard repair procedures." Custom solutions. "I'll need to recalibrate the power distribution networks, reprogram the neural interface protocols, and essentially rebuild the shielding array from components that were never designed to work together." David pulled up holographic displays showing the required modifications. "It's doable, but it will take time and considerable expertise." "Time I can provide. Expertise appears to be available." Lyra moved closer to examine the diagnostic displays, revealing knowledge of armor systems that was considerably more sophisticated than David would have expected from most clients. "The neural interface modifications, can they be improved during the repair process?" "Improved how?" "Enhanced response time, better integration with the adaptive plating, perhaps improved compatibility with additional system types." Lyra's interest in the technical specifications suggested she understood the implications of the modifications she was requesting. David considered the possibilities, feeling the familiar excitement that came with challenging engineering problems. "It's possible, though it would require some experimental approaches that haven't been fully tested in field conditions." "I trust your expertise." "In that case, we'd better get started. This is going to take the better part of 2 days, and I'll need to fabricate several components from scratch." David began clearing workspace for the extensive repairs. "You're welcome to observe if you're interested in the technical aspects, though I should warn you that armor modification can be fairly tedious for non-engineers." "I find technical processes fascinating," Lyra replied with a smile that suggested she genuinely meant it. "And I prefer understanding the systems that protect my life, rather than simply trusting that they will function when needed." As David began the complex process of disassembling and reconfiguring the armor systems, he found himself enjoying both the technical challenge and his clients' informed questions about the repair procedures. Lyra proved to be knowledgeable about both human and Velnathi technologies, able to discuss power distribution theory and defensive system optimization, with the fluency of someone whose life had depended on understanding these systems. What David didn't realize was that his work was being monitored by sensors throughout New Geneva Station that were designed to detect and identify Velnathi royal armor signatures, or that every modification he made was being recorded by security systems that would soon identify him as having performed services that triggered ancient laws he'd never heard of. He also didn't realize that Lyra's casual knowledge of advanced combat systems and her comfort with equipment that should have been available only to the highest levels of Velnathi military hierarchy suggested she was considerably more than an independent contractor seeking routine repairs. But as the hours passed and the armor took shape under his skilled hands, David found himself thinking that regardless of who she really was, Lyra was definitely the most interesting client he'd worked with in years. He had no way of knowing that interesting was about to become the least complicated aspect of their rapidly developing relationship. The first indication that David's armor repairs had triggered something beyond routine maintenance came 12 hours into the project, when his workshop's security clearance was quietly upgraded to levels that should have required command authorization and extensive background verification. The changes were subtle. Access panels that had previously been restricted now responded to his biometric signature. Diagnostic systems that had been limited to basic functions suddenly offered advanced capabilities, and power allocation protocols that had operated under standard limitations began providing resources normally reserved for critical operations. "That's odd," David said, noting that his fabrication systems were now offering material synthesis options that definitely hadn't been available that morning. "Lyra, did you arrange for any special authorizations for this repair work?" Special authorizations. Lyra looked up from the technical manual she'd been reading, her expression carefully neutral. "What kind of authorizations?" "The kind that give me access to restricted fabrication protocols and command-level diagnostic systems." David pulled up a display showing his current clearance levels, which now included categories he was certain he'd never been certified for. "Either someone in station administration made a mistake, or your equipment is somehow triggering automatic upgrades to my access permissions." Lyra studied the display with an intensity that suggested the information was more significant than routine administrative confusion. "Have you encountered similar situations with other clients' equipment?" "Never. Most civilian gear doesn't even register on the station's security systems, let alone trigger clearance modifications." David continued his work on the armor's neural interface while puzzling over the access changes. "Though I have to admit, your suit incorporates technologies that are considerably more sophisticated than most civilian equipment." "How sophisticated?" "Sophisticated enough that I'm beginning to wonder if training exercise covers the full scope of whatever situation required repairs this extensive." David looked at her directly, noting the alert intelligence in her violet eyes and the way she seemed to be evaluating his questions for implications beyond simple curiosity. "Care to be more specific about what kind of work you do that requires this level of defensive capability?" "I work in situations where equipment reliability can be the difference between mission success and mission failure," Lyra replied with the careful precision that suggested she was choosing her words to provide information without revealing details that might complicate their professional relationship. "Mission failure that involves weapons fire, based on the damage patterns I've been repairing." "Sometimes situations become complicated despite everyone's best intentions." David nodded, accepting the explanation while privately noting that Lyra's evasiveness suggested she was either involved in activities that required operational security, or she was someone whose identity needed to be protected for reasons that extended beyond routine privacy concerns. Either way, his job was to repair her equipment, not investigate her background. The neural interface modifications proved to be even more complex than David had initially estimated, requiring him to essentially create new integration protocols that could handle the sophisticated biometric monitoring systems built into the armor. As he worked, he found himself impressed by the suit's design philosophy. Every system had been optimized not just for performance, but for adaptability to changing tactical situations and long-term reliability under extreme stress. Whoever designed this armor understood that the wearer might need to depend on it for extended periods without maintenance support, David observed, noting the self-diagnostic capabilities and redundant safety systems that were built into every major component. "This is equipment designed for someone who operates independently in high-risk environments." "Independence is often necessary in my line of work," Lyra agreed, though something in her tone suggested that independence wasn't always a choice she would have preferred to make. As David integrated the final modifications and began testing the completed systems, he noticed that station sensors throughout the facility were responding to the armor's activation with increased attention. His workstation's displays showed that security systems across New Geneva Station were now monitoring his workshop with the kind of focus typically reserved for high-priority diplomatic activities. "Lyra," David said, watching status indicators that suggested his work had triggered automated protocols he didn't understand, "I think your equipment might be more significant than either of us realized." Before she could respond, David's communication system chimed with an incoming priority message from station administration. Master Chen, please report to Security Chief Morrison's office immediately for consultation on equipment modification protocols. Bring your current client and all related documentation. Security Chief Morrison wants to see both of us, David announced, noting that Lyra's expression had shifted from curiosity to something that looked suspiciously like resignation. Along with all the documentation related to your armor modifications. I was hoping to avoid administrative complications, Lyra said quietly, though her tone suggested she had been expecting this development rather than fearing it. Administrative complications related to what exactly? Lyra looked at the completed armor, its systems now functioning with integration and performance levels that exceeded the original specifications, then at David, whose skilled work had created capabilities that neither human nor Velnathi engineers had achieved working independently. Related to the fact that the equipment you've been repairing belongs to someone whose identity makes routine maintenance into a matter of interstellar political significance, she said, with the kind of careful honesty that suggested she was finally ready to explain why a simple repair job had triggered security alerts throughout the station. Someone whose identity. David felt his understanding of the situation begin to shift as implications he hadn't considered started becoming apparent. Someone whose armor carries quantum signatures that identify anyone who performs major modifications as having bonded with the royal bloodline through the ancient rite of shield. Lyra's voice carried formal weight that transformed their professional relationship into something considerably more complex. Someone who should have mentioned that information before allowing you to activate systems that would bind your fate to hers under laws that predate both our civilizations' contact with each other. David stared at her, processing the information that his client was not only more than she'd appeared to be, but that his expert armor repairs had apparently activated ancient laws that he'd never heard of and didn't understand. When you say royal bloodline, he said carefully, exactly how royal are we talking about? Princess Lyra Velnathi, she replied formally, her posture shifting to the kind of dignified bearing that made her previous casual demeanor look like a performance. Heir to the throne of the Velnathi Empire, and the person whose equipment modifications have just made you a provisional consort witness under laws that grant you command authority over defensive systems throughout this station. As security alerts continued cascading through the station's communication networks, and David realized that his reputation for discretion and expertise had just involved him in political situations that his engineering training had never covered. He began to understand why his client had been evasive about the details of her identity. So, he said, looking at the princess of the Velnathi Empire standing in his cluttered workshop surrounded by the tools and spare parts of his trade, I'm guessing that consultation with Security Chief Morrison is going to be considerably more complicated than routine equipment registration. Considerably more complicated, Princess Lyra agreed with a smile that was both apologetic and genuinely affectionate. Though I should mention that the bonding created by your work also provides certain protections that may prove useful when the political implications of our relationship become apparent to people who have strong opinions about interspecies cooperation. As they prepared to face whatever administrative complications awaited them, David realized that his simple day of armor repair had evolved into something that would either advance interstellar diplomacy or create the kind of political crisis that would be studied by historians for generations to come. Either way, it was definitely the most interesting repair job he'd ever completed. The meeting with Security Chief Morrison took place in a briefing room that had been hastily upgraded with additional security protocols and communication, links to both human and Velnathi command structures, suggesting that David's armor modifications had triggered reactions that extended far beyond routine station administration. Master Chen, Chief Morrison began without preamble, Explain to me why half the defensive systems on this station are now responding to your biometric signature with authorization levels that I didn't approve and can't override. David looked around the briefing room at the assembled officials. Morrison, several human diplomatic personnel whose expressions ranged from concern to alarm, and a group of Velnathi representatives whose formal bearing suggested they held positions of considerable authority within their delegation. I performed extensive modifications on Princess Lyra's combat armor, David replied, deciding that straightforward honesty was probably his best strategy given the circumstances. The work involved integrating human and Velnathi technologies in ways that required custom solutions and significant system recalibration. Princess Lyra, Morrison repeated, his tone suggesting that the royal title added layers of complexity to the situation that he wasn't prepared to handle. Your Highness, were you planning to mention your identity before or after your equipment modifications triggered ancient bonding laws? I had hoped that the repairs could be completed without activating the Right of Shield protocols. Princess Lyra replied with the formal dignity that marked her as someone accustomed to taking responsibility for decisions that had far-reaching consequences. Master Chen's expertise exceeded my expectations, and the integration he achieved was sophisticated enough to trigger recognition systems that have been dormant for generations. Recognition systems that have now granted a civilian engineer command authority over military-grade defensive networks, added one of the Velnathi officials, whose tone carried disapproval mixed with grudging respect. Authority that includes override capabilities for evacuation protocols and emergency response systems. David studied the tactical displays that showed his new access permissions, realizing that his armor work had somehow granted him responsibility for systems he'd never trained to operate. I'm not qualified to command defensive networks or emergency protocols. My expertise is equipment maintenance and modification. The Right of Shield doesn't evaluate qualifications in terms of formal training, Princess Lyra explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the legal and cultural implications of the situation. It recognizes demonstration of skill, dedication, and trustworthiness through actions rather than credentials. Your work on my armor proved that you possess the technical expertise and personal integrity necessary to protect the royal bloodline. Which means, Chief Morrison said grimly, that Mr. Chen is now legally bound to Princess Lyra's protection under Velnathi law, while simultaneously holding command authority over station systems that he never requested and may not want. Before David could respond to this assessment of his situation, emergency alarms began sounding throughout the station, not the routine alerts used for scheduled drills, but the urgent signals that indicated immediate threats to station security. Multiple contacts approaching from the outer system announced the station's artificial intelligence. Velnathi vessels, configuration suggests military rather than diplomatic. Fleet composition includes vessels not registered with current delegation credentials. The tactical displays immediately shifted to show the approaching ships, their formation patterns and approach vectors suggesting hostile intent rather than reinforcement of the existing diplomatic mission. Those are ships under the command of General Corvith, one of the Velnathi officials said, his expression shifting from diplomatic concern to alarm. He was relieved of command 3 months ago for questioning the succession protocols. If he's approaching with military force, he's staging a coup, Princess Lyra finished, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had been expecting this possibility. The peace negotiations have threatened his position, and my presence here has provided him with an opportunity to eliminate me while claiming that humans are holding me hostage. Chief Morrison activated emergency protocols while consulting tactical assessments that painted the approaching force as considerably more powerful than the station's normal defensive capabilities. How long until they reach engagement range? 47 minutes, the AI replied. Current defensive systems are insufficient to repel a force of this size and configuration. Unless, Princess Lyra said, looking directly at David, we activate the enhanced defensive protocols that the Right of Shield has placed under your authority. Systems that were designed to protect the royal bloodline during exactly this kind of crisis. David looked at the tactical displays showing the approaching coup forces, then at Princess Lyra, whose calm confidence suggested she had been preparing for this moment despite hoping it wouldn't arrive. What exactly would activating these protocols involve? He asked. Accepting full responsibility for my protection and the protection of anyone else on this station who might be threatened by the coup attempt, Princess Lyra replied. The Right of Shield grants authority, because it assumes the bonded protector will use that authority to defend not just the royal bloodline, but the principles of justice and peace that the bloodline represents. And if I don't accept this responsibility, then General Corvith's forces will overwhelm the station's defenses, eliminate me and anyone who might testify about their coup attempt, and return to Velnathi space claiming that humans attacked a diplomatic mission. Princess Lyra's expression grew serious. The peace negotiations will collapse, and both our peoples will return to a state of hostility that benefits no one except those who profit from continued conflict. Chief Morrison consulted his tactical assessments, his expression growing grimmer as the approaching force's capabilities became clear. Mr. Chen, I hate to put this kind of pressure on a civilian, but if you have access to defensive systems that could help us protect this station and everyone on it, I think we need to seriously consider using them. David looked around the briefing room at the faces of people whose safety had suddenly become his responsibility through circumstances he'd never anticipated and laws he barely understood. Princess Lyra, whose intelligence and strength had impressed him during their work together. Chief Morrison and his staff, whose job was protecting the station and everyone on it. The Velnathi officials, whose dedication to peaceful resolution had put them in danger from their own military hardliners. If I accept this authority, David said finally, what exactly am I committing to beyond the immediate crisis? You're committing to a partnership that could reshape the relationship between our species, Princess Lyra replied, her voice carrying depths of hope and determination that suggested she saw possibilities in their accidental bonding that extended far beyond emergency response. The Right of Shield creates connections that transcend political boundaries and species differences. If we can work together to defeat this coup attempt, we can prove that cooperation is not only possible but more effective than the hostility that others try to maintain. As the tactical displays showed General Corvith's forces continuing their approach and time running out for defensive preparations, David realized that his choice would determine not just their immediate survival, but the future of interstellar relations between two civilizations that had been kept apart by those who profited from their division. All right, he said, stepping toward the command console that would grant him access to defensive systems he'd never trained to operate. Let's see what these ancient laws can do about modern military problems. As he placed his hand on the authorization panel and felt the station's enhanced defensive systems respond to his biometric signature, the first engagement came as General Corvith's forces entered the outer defensive perimeter, their initial assault probing for weaknesses in the station's enhanced shielding, while broadcasting demands for the immediate surrender of the human kidnappers holding Princess Lyra against her will. They're claiming we're holding you hostage, Chief Morrison observed, monitoring communications traffic that painted the coup as a rescue mission rather than an illegal seizure of power. Standard procedure for military coups, Princess Lyra replied calmly. Create a narrative that justifies the use of force while portraying the conspirators as heroes rather than traitors. David found himself adapting to the command interface with surprising speed. the station's AI providing tactical assessments and defensive options, while systems he'd never seen before responded to his intentions as much as his direct commands. The enhanced defensive grid included not just weapons and shields, but sensor arrays that could analyze the attacking ship's capabilities and communication networks that could coordinate with loyal Velnathi forces throughout the sector. "Princess," came a transmission from the lead attack vessel. "This is General Corvith. I know you're being held against your will by human interrogators. Surrender yourself to us immediately, and we'll ensure your safe return to Velnathi space." "General Corvith," Princess Lyra replied through the station's communication system, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the political implications of every word she spoke. "I am here of my own free will as part of ongoing peace negotiations. Your attack on a diplomatic station constitutes treason against the crown and an act of war against humanity. You have been compromised by human manipulation and are no longer competent to make decisions regarding your own safety or the interests of the Velnathi people." "I am perfectly competent to recognize treason when I encounter it," Princess Lyra said, her formal tone making it clear that she was speaking as heir to the throne rather than as a diplomatic negotiator. "You have 30 seconds to withdraw your forces, or I will authorize defensive actions that will result in your capture and trial for high treason." The attack that followed was coordinated and professional, but the enhanced defensive systems David now controlled proved capable of responses that the coup forces hadn't anticipated. Weapon batteries that should have been able to overwhelm the station's shields found themselves firing into defensive field that adapted to their attack patterns, while their communications were disrupted by countermeasures that prevented effective coordination between their ships. "They're not prepared for this level of defensive capability," David observed, watching the tactical displays show the attacking forces growing confusion as their assault failed to achieve the quick victory they had clearly expected. "They expected to face standard diplomatic station defenses," Princess Lyra replied, coordinating with loyal Velnathi vessels that were responding to the emergency signals triggered by the rite of shield activation. "They did not anticipate that my bonding with a skilled engineer would grant access to systems that have been dormant since the expansion wars." The turning point came when David's access to the station's enhanced sensor arrays allowed him to identify the command structure coordinating the attack, while his control over communication systems permitted him to broadcast evidence of the conspiracy to Velnathi authorities throughout the sector. The coup wasn't just about eliminating Princess Lyra. It was about installing a military government that would abandon peace negotiations in favor of renewed expansion and conquest. "This is Admiral Veltara of the Royal Fleet," came a transmission from the Velnathi ships arriving to reinforce the station. "General Corvith, you are ordered to stand down immediately and submit to arrest for high treason. Princess Lyra, please confirm your status and location." "Admiral, this is Princess Lyra. I am safe aboard New Geneva Station under the protection of the Right of Shield bond with Master Engineer David Chen, whose expertise and dedication have proven crucial to exposing this conspiracy." The formal ceremony to complete the Right of Shield took place in David's workshop, while the coup forces were being taken into custody, surrounded by the tools and equipment that had made their bonding possible. Princess Lyra explained that the ritual would make their connection permanent and legally binding, transforming David from a provisional protector into a permanent member of the royal household, with authority that transcended species boundaries. "You understand," she said as they prepared for the ceremony that would bind their fates together permanently, "that accepting this bonding means accepting responsibility not just for my protection, but for the welfare of both our peoples. The authority granted by the Right of Shield is intended to serve justice and peace rather than personal ambition." "I understand," David replied, looking around his workshop where this impossible partnership had begun with routine equipment repairs and evolved into something that would reshape interstellar diplomacy. Though I should probably mention that my expertise is still primarily in equipment maintenance and modification, regardless of what ancient laws say about my qualifications for royal protection. Equipment maintenance and modification that saved both our lives and exposed a conspiracy that would have destroyed the peace our peoples have been trying to build. Princess Lyra pointed out with a smile that made David realize that their partnership had grown into something deeper than legal bonding or political alliance. 6 months later, David found himself reviewing reports from the joint Human-Velnathi research facility that had grown from their collaboration, watching teams of engineers and technicians work on integration, projects that neither species could have accomplished independently. The new armor systems are exceeding all performance specifications, Princess Lyra reported, her role as Director of Technological Integration keeping her busy coordinating projects that combined human innovation with Velnathi advanced materials. The integration principles you developed are being applied to everything from personal protective equipment to starship defensive systems. Integration principles that started with trying to fix blast damage in a sophisticated exosuit, David replied, still amazed by how his routine repair work had evolved into revolutionary advances in defensive technology. Though I have to admit, managing research and development programs is considerably more complex than individual equipment modification. More complex than you anticipated. Much more complex, but also more meaningful than I knew was possible. David looked out at the research facility where human and Velnathi engineers collaborated on projects that would benefit both species. Besides, the company is exceptional. Princess Lyra laughed, moving to join him at the observation window that overlooked laboratories where impossible partnerships created possibilities that neither species had imagined working alone. Even when the company includes a princess whose idea of relaxation involves reviewing technical specifications for quantum shield generators. Especially then, though I should probably warn you that your tendency to suggest improvements to my designs is making our research teams question whether I'm actually the expert in this relationship. You're the expert in seeing possibilities that others miss, Princess Lyra said, taking his hand with the easy affection that had grown from their shared challenges and mutual respect. The Rite of Shield recognized that quality in you before either of us understood its significance. As they stood together watching the impossible collaboration between species that had been kept apart by those who profited from their division, David reflected on how dramatically his understanding of his work had evolved. He'd started as someone who fixed equipment that others had damaged through carelessness or conflict, and somehow become someone who built bridges between civilizations that had forgotten how to trust each other. The work was more complex now, involving research programs that spanned star systems and political implications that required constant diplomatic attention. But at its core, it was still the same mission he'd always served, taking things that were broken and making them work better than they had before. The only difference was that now, things that were broken sometimes meant relationships between species that had been systematically prevented from understanding each other. And making them work better involved combining technologies and perspectives in ways that created entirely new possibilities for cooperation and mutual protection. David Chen had always been in the business of equipment repair. He just never imagined that the most important thing he'd ever fix would be the trust between civilizations, one innovative solution at a time. Speaking of improvements, Princess Lyra said, activating a display that showed the latest reports from their joint defense initiatives, the Guardian Fleet project is ready for its first full-scale deployment. 12 ships equipped with integrated human-Velnathi defensive systems, crewed by mixed-species teams using the protocols we developed. 12 ships whose defensive capabilities exceed anything either of our species could build independently, David replied, studying the technical specifications with the satisfaction that came from seeing theoretical improvements become practical realities. Though I still can't quite believe that my workshop modifications have become the foundation for an entirely new class of starship design. Your workshop modifications proved that cooperation produces better results than competition or conflict. The Guardian fleet is just the logical extension of that principle applied to interstellar defense. David looked at the images of ships that incorporated his integration techniques with technologies that pushed the boundaries of what either human or Velnathi engineers had thought possible. The vessels were beautiful in the way that perfectly functional equipment could be beautiful. Every system optimized not just for individual performance, but for seamless cooperation with complementary technologies. "You know," he said, "when that damaged exosuit first arrived in my workshop, the most complicated outcome I imagined was maybe having to fabricate some custom components from scratch. And instead, I accidentally married into alien royalty, gained command authority over defensive systems I'd never heard of, helped suppress a military coup, and ended up responsible for research programs that are reshaping the technological development of two civilizations." David grinned, shaking his head at the improbable trajectory his simple repair job had created. "It's considerably more complex than routine maintenance contracts. More complex than you wanted. Much more complex than I planned, but exactly as complex as it needed to be." David squeezed her hand gently, marveling at how their partnership had grown from professional interaction into something that encompassed both personal affection and shared commitment to building a better future for both their peoples. "Besides, I've learned that the most important repairs are often the ones that create something entirely new rather than just restoring something to its original condition." Princess Lyra moved closer, her presence filling the space between them with the kind of warmth that made their impossible partnership feel like the most natural thing in the universe. "Even when those repairs involve binding your fate permanently to someone whose people initially viewed you with considerable suspicion. Especially when they involve that, some partnerships are worth the political complications they create." David looked at the research facility where human and Velnathi teams worked together on projects that would have been inconceivable just months before. And some complications turn out to be opportunities in disguise. Opportunities to prove that cooperation is more effective than conflict. Opportunities to prove that the best solutions usually come from combining different perspectives and expertise, rather than trying to solve problems alone. David activated another display, showing communication logs from across the sector where other species were requesting assistance with their own integration challenges. "Speaking of which, we've received 17 requests for consultation on defensive system integration from species who have heard about our work. 17 requests for expanding the Guardian Fleet principle to other civilizations. 17 requests for help with equipment problems that turn out to involve political and cultural challenges as much as technical ones." David studied the requests, noting that they came from conflicts and partnerships across multiple star systems. "I'm beginning to think that the right of shield might be more than just Velnathi law. It might be a universal principle that recognizes bonds between people who choose to protect each other rather than exploit their differences. A universal principle that creates families from partnerships and builds peace from individual acts of expertise and dedication." "Exactly. Though I should probably mention that if we're going to start accepting consultation requests from 17 different species, I'm going to need a bigger workshop." Princess Lyra laughed, her joy carrying harmonics that made the research facility's systems resonate in sympathy. "I think we can arrange for expanded facilities. The Royal Engineering Corps has been asking for permanent quarters near the research complex anyway." The Royal Engineering Corps wants to relocate here. The Royal Engineering Corps wants to learn from the human engineer, who proved that the most advanced defensive systems in Velnathi history could be improved through creative integration and innovative problem-solving approaches. Princess Lyra's expression grew serious. David, what you accomplished with my armor wasn't just expert repair work. It was a demonstration that our technologies and our peoples are more compatible than either side had dared to imagine. As they stood together in the observation area that had become their private refuge from the demands of building an interstellar alliance, David reflected on the strange turns his career had taken. He'd started as someone who solved individual equipment problems through technical expertise and patient craftsmanship, and somehow become someone who solved civilizational problems through the same principles applied on a larger scale. The work was more complex now, involving research protocols that spanned galaxies and diplomatic considerations that required constant attention to the political implications of every technical decision. But the fundamental approach remained the same. Identify what wasn't working properly, figure out why it wasn't working, and develop solutions that made everything function better than before. The only difference was that now, what wasn't working properly sometimes meant centuries of mistrust between species that had been systematically prevented from understanding their compatibility. And solutions that made everything function better involved creating new forms of cooperation that neither civilization had previously imagined possible. 3 months later, as David watched the first graduating class of the Integration Engineering program, human and Velnathi students who had learned to work with technologies from both cultures as naturally as they worked with their own, he realized that his accidental bonding with Princess Lyra had become the foundation for an entirely new field of engineering that specialized in building bridges between civilizations. The integration principles are being adopted by the Technical University on Earth and the Royal Academy on Velnathi Prime, Princess Lyra reported, her satisfaction evident as she reviewed the academic programs that had grown from their collaboration. Next year's enrollment includes students from 12 different species. 12 species learning to integrate their technologies with others rather than developing them in isolation, David replied, watching students whose diverse backgrounds had become assets rather than barriers to learning. I wonder what they'll build that we haven't thought of yet. Whatever it is, I'm sure it will exceed our expectations. The most innovative solutions usually do. David looked around at the impossible facility they had built together, part research center, part diplomatic mission, part workshop, where the principles of creative problem-solving were applied to challenges that spanned star systems, and realized that his simple philosophy of making broken